Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what's known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Today we're going to talk about how to write well, and it's something I've struggled with my entire life, and so I want to share with you my struggles, but also give you some tips as to how you might not struggle as much as I did. Basically what happened is, while I was doing my doctorate here in Oxford, my supervisor got so sick of how I was writing that he ordered me to read this book, which is called Why I Write by George Orwell. And in it, Orwell has this sort of manifesto about why it's important for writers to keep writing, but in particular to write clearly so that people can understand them. And it's so true. So this is part of my general series about how to write better essays. And you can't talk about writing better essays without talking about writing better, just in general. And so I'm going to go through the 6 rules that Orwell sets out so beautifully and plainly himself, and explain why they're such a good idea for essay writing. Could be for school, could be for university, could be for doctorate. These rules almost always apply perfectly. Okay, so let's dive in. Now, for each of the rules, I've got an example from mostly journalism to do with the the Prince Harry and Meghan Markle drama that's playing out here in the UK. Okay, now what I'm not trying to do is say that these journalists have just been horrible with their writing and they need to go back to school. What I'm saying is that in the context it works fine, the approach they've used for writing, but if they were writing at a university I might have a bit more of a problem with it. Okay, so let's start with rule number 1. I have to wear these tinted glasses because I'm half blind, so just bear with me. I'm going to have to move pretty close to the screen as well, so hopefully you'll still be able to see me all right. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you're used to seeing in print. Okay, so metaphor, simile, what all of these imply are that you're talking about a fictional world, not the real world. And that's Orwell's big problem with it, that we often use these sorts of images in order to pep up our writing and make it a bit more zingy and poetic and interesting. But it's not real. It's not the real world. It's not literally what's happening. And that's a bit of a problem. Now, in some contexts, being a bit imaginative and using some nice peppy ideas and idioms and turns of phrase and whatnot is fine. And indeed, in this context of a Harry and Meghan headline from the Daily Mail, it's really gripping, so you can see why they've used it. But if you're writing an academic essay, it'll be a real problem. And it happens a lot. Students often use metaphors in essays. And one of the biggest problems is that they're just not aware that they're doing it. And that is the true, the big issue with any writing, is that you're just becoming unaware of yourself and you're not making conscious choices, and the language that you're using is coming from somebody else, that you've got these sort of set phrases that are tumbling out of your brain and you're trying to connect those things coming out of your brain with someone else, and it's going to be really hard unless you're really clear as to why you've chosen certain words over others. Anyway, let me go through the example and hopefully it'll make a bit more sense. My family helped to drive out Meghan. So drive out is the metaphor in that first line, like Meghan is livestock. Harry launches another extraordinary attack. Well, he didn't launch anything on the royal family, branding them abusers. Right, so this is giving us the image of Harry with a smoking hot branding iron with abusers written on it. Anyway, let's not get into detail. He didn't brand anyone, okay? In TV interview that is likened to taking a flamethrower to them. So the last few lines, the headline writers acknowledge that this is full of similes, because they say it's been likened to taking a flamethrower. I mean, it really is nothing like taking a flamethrower to the royal family, right? So this gives you a sense of how ridiculous sometimes metaphors can be, because it just completely takes us out of reality. Again, it's entirely clear why the journalists have done this. So I'm not criticising them at all. This is completely understandable. They're trying to grip people's attention. They're trying to use shocking, raw imagery. And so they pepper their sayings with lots of important, interesting metaphors, right? It totally makes sense. But in an essay, it would just be no good, because you'd just not be talking about reality, right? And essays are supposed to be disentangling reality. So yeah, no metaphors, please, no similes. Okay, rule number 2, never use a long word where a short one will do. Okay, this is a really good rule. Now, when I started university, and indeed right up to the present day, and I've been in university my entire adult life, I felt like I didn't really belong, like I didn't really deserve to be here. That's the phenomenon called imposter syndrome. It's very common. Surveys have suggested about 90% of the students and staff here at Oxford have some form of imposter syndrome, and I'm definitely one of them. And so what it meant is that I would basically be pretending to be someone I'm not. And so I was literally pretentious. I was, trying not to be myself because I thought myself wasn't good enough. And so I'd use long words because I thought, well, clever people use long words and I need to pretend to be a clever person, so I better use long words. And that was understandable, but it was a mistake because I was using long words basically to hide. It was almost like a suit of armour, if I can use my own metaphor there, to try and hide from the world and to stop people seeing and hearing from me directly. And so that's the problem. And so if you can keep your words nice and short, then just do it. It just makes everything clearer. One thing I've noticed is that the further I go through academia, the more senior people become, the more simple and plain their language is. It's unadorned, it's accessible, it's easy, and it's not flowery, and it's definitely not pretentious. So here's an example from The Guardian. And again, I'm not accusing The Guardian of being pretentious or flowery, but they're using quite a lot of long words, basically. And again, in an essay, it probably wouldn't be very helpful. If you weigh the anger and hurt felt by two exceptionally wealthy and entitled people living in California against the struggles and deprivation facing millions of underpaid Britons grappling with a daunting cost of living crisis and unable to afford a Netflix contract, there can only be one conclusion. Right, so the opening line to this, if you weigh the anger and hurt felt by two, is nice and short, pithy, really easy, really accessible. But then the polysyllabic words come thick and fast. Polysyllabic's an awful long word, so I shouldn't have used that. Exceptionally wealthy, could have just replaced that with very rich or rich. Entitled, it's an interesting word. Obviously it has quite an important loaded meaning, but its meaning is a bit contested, and that's often the problem with long words, is that people don't really agree on what they mean, so it can be quite difficult. Struggles and deprivation, again, those words could have been shorter, could have been easier. But don't get me wrong, again, in this context, it's fine. This is a Guardian editorial, it's fine, makes sense. But if you're writing a personal statement where you might have been character limited, you've got to keep everything really short, you could have cut some of these words out or cut them down, and you would have communicated the same meaning, but you would have done it better because it would be more easy to understand. And that's the ultimate point of academic writing. Okay. Rule number 3, related to rule number 2, if it is possible to cut a word out, cut it out. Always cut it out, says Orwell. So true, right? My sentences used to be ridiculously long and run on for multiple lines and be full of clauses and subclauses and semicolons and oh goodness. So that was the one thing that my DPhil supervisor, the late great Professor David Robertson, was really annoyed about, was how long my sentences were. And he was completely right. And I realised that I could cut my sentences into 3 or 4 sometimes, and everything would be just much clearer. So if you can, do it, right? Now the example I've got here comes from Fox News. And in this case, it's not that the sentences are particularly long, but it's just quite repetitive. And they are using quite a lot of redundant words where they could have just simplified things much more easily. So Buckingham Palace officials have declined to comment on any of the allegations made in Harry's book. A spokesperson for King Charles III didn't immediately respond to Fox News Digital's request for comment. A spokesperson for Kensington Palace, which represents the Prince and Princess of Wales, told Fox News Digital it doesn't have a comment. It's basically said 3 times in a row that no one wanted to talk to them. Okay, and they could have done that in a line, right? Now, I know why they're doing this, why they're being a bit more verbose, is because these days online journalists want lots of space for selling adverts, so they're kind of incentivized to write lots, so it's fine. Again, they're not being stupid, they know what they're doing, but in an essay or in a covering letter or a personal statement, just repeating yourself 3 times would be completely a waste of your own time, so don't do it. Okay, rule number 4 for Orwell: never use the passive where you can use the active. Now, I found it really hard to find an example of this because journalists very rarely use the passive. The passive form is where it's not clear who's kicking whom, in the beautiful words of Helen Sword, who's an amazing author about stylish academic writing, and I'll link all of the great works that she's done in the description. And what she means by that is, you need to know in a sentence who's kicking whom, right? What's the subject, what's the object, what's the verb? And when you use the passive form, you don't often tell the audience who the subject is. So really common in student essays are things like, it is often thought that, or it could be argued the other. And I'm just sitting here thinking, yeah, who thinks that? Who's arguing that, right? I don't want this passivity, I want this active. Tell me who's doing these verbs that you're using. So be very mindful of use of the passive form. Now the example I could find came from The Observer in the UK, and it goes as follows: the scandalous leaked phone conversation between Diana and her lover. So leaked there is a passive form of the verb, and because it doesn't say who leaked it. Now it's completely obvious why they used the passive form, because they don't know who leaked it, so it's reasonable in this case. But in other contexts, using passive forms of verbs is very common. People just do it without thinking, and it's just not very clear. It's not very helpful. You know, the ultimate point of writing is to communicate your ideas. You're trying to merge brains with another human, you know, and you can't do that mind meld if you're using all of this sort of, you know, elision and ducking and diving, which is what the passive form of verbs basically does. Okay, rule number 5, never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. So this is really interesting. So Orwell is definitely not saying don't use foreign words because Orwell doesn't like foreigners. Okay, he definitely wasn't like that. So what he's saying is just use words that can be easily understood, so that you can have the widest possible audience and the biggest possible impact. And again, it's such good advice. The temptation is to use exotic words which make you seem very clever, but fundamentally difficult to understand, or indeed words that have really contested meanings, and therefore, you know, you're just going to struggle to get your meaning across to other people. Now, the example I found was not journalism, because journalists are pretty good at actually not using too much jargon. The example I have is from the House of Lords, which were having a debate about the role of Prince Harry in the Constitution. And so, as you might expect in a legislature, they were using all sorts of complicated technical words like sovereign and legislation and constitutional and so on and so forth. So it's totally reasonable that they were using those words, right? So again, I'm not saying, oh goodness, how awful their language is. But in a student essay, even a student essay about the Constitution, they would actually be getting into a bit of difficulty if they use so many technical words without clarity as to what they mean. And take Orwell's rule literally. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. So sometimes you may not be able to use an alternative. Sometimes you just have to use that technical bit of jargon. But if you can use an alternative, even if you're writing in a field where you think everyone gets what your technical word means, try and see if you can, because it'll probably just make everything clearer. It'll make everyone understand what you're trying to say so much better. Okay, so that's the general principle. And then lastly, Orwell finishes with this really strong rule 6. Break any of these rules, any of them, sooner than say anything outright barbarous. Okay, so pretty clear stuff, right? And this is where Orwell's getting into the politics of language and how language is such a powerful tool and therefore potentially such a powerful weapon. Now, how could you be barbarous by, you know, not using metaphors or by using short sentences? Well, I mean, we see it on Twitter all the time, right? People are just uncivil and so literally barbaric to each other because they're being so cruel in their language. And there they apply all of Orwell's rules. It's nice and short, there's no technical words, and they are just going directly to their target and saying something really horrible. So you shouldn't do that. You know, it may be that sometimes using slightly more flowery, metaphorical, indirect language is good if what you're trying to do is to cut someone down. But otherwise, Orwell's rules apply so strongly. And these were completely game-changing for me, if I can use my own metaphor there. Because before reading the book and being told to sort my writing out, my essays and my thesis were just very difficult to get. and very difficult to follow. And so people just didn't want to read it. They would disengage, their brains would hurt after a couple of paragraphs because my sentences were too long. And I'm not saying I've nailed it, far from it. I will always find this tough. But I think that's the point, right? Writing is a skill, it's an art form, it takes determination. It's not a gift, it's not something that you're born with. No one's born with the ability to write. It's incredibly unnatural to write. So we have to learn it and we have to hone the skill. And I think perhaps the biggest takeaway that Orwell, I think, would put across is that you've just got to know what you're doing. So often in writing and speaking, we just become self-aware, we switch off and we sort of lapse into a state of unconsciousness where we are starting to just allow metaphors to tumble out of our mouth. We start thinking, what does the audience say? I need to sound like the audience. Rather than just being yourself and authentically saying what you think in really simple, straightforward prose, people start to just affect all of these pretensions and they're being someone else. Don't do that. Okay? So have a think about the rules, see how you get along with them. Let me know in the comments what you think of the rules or what you think of the examples. And I'll be with you next time to talk about how to structure the entire essay, which is one of the most troubling things for most of my students. And it's something, again, that I've always found difficult. But there are some pretty easy tricks you can apply, which will hopefully make things much easier. So thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll be with you next time.